For this lesson, you need to open the sample file International Price List from your Sample Files folder. This lesson introduces mixed cell references. Before we tackle mixed cell references, I must warn you that this subject is a bit of a brain teaser. The skill's well worth mastering, as you'll find it extremely useful in many types of real-world worksheets. But don't worry if you're unable to understand this concept at first. In my Essential Skills classroom courses, I've found that many students find mixed cell references a very difficult concept to understand. I never waste a lot of time on this lesson if it's clear that some students are unable to easily follow the logic. I'd advise that you take the same approach and don't waste a lot of time on this lesson if you find it difficult to follow. You won't need to use mixed cell references anywhere else in the Essential Skills course, and it's a skill that most office workers don't have. If you do skip this lesson, it's well worthwhile returning to it later, when you've completed the course and have been using Excel for a few months. By then, you'll probably have encountered some of the real-world business problems that are more efficiently solved using mixed cell references. So now I've dispensed that health warning, let's get on with the lesson and examine this worksheet. You can see that I have the USA dollar prices in column C, and I have some rather out-of-date exchange rates for 5 of the world's major currencies in cells D4 to H4. If you'd like a bit more realism, you could get today's exchange rate by visiting the oanda.com website and substitute them for these rather out-of-date exchange rates. Let's begin by entering a formula into cell D6 that will work out the price of the Shelby Aero in Great Britain pounds. So I'll click in cell D6. The formula is very simple, equals on the keyboard, click on the price of the Shelby, the multiplication operator, and then click on the GBP US dollar exchange rate. I'll press the Enter key, and you can see that the price of the Ultimate Aero in Great Britain pounds is £335,020 and 8 pennies. Now, I don't think we'd be terribly interested in the 8 pennies in such a large number, so I'll select cells D6 to H17, and on the Home tab of the ribbon in the Number group, I'll click the Decrease Decimal Places button a couple of times just to get rid of the pennies. Now let's look at the formulas behind the cells rather than the values in the cells. To do that, I click Formulas on the ribbon, and in the Formula Auditing group, the Show Formulas button. And we can see the C6 times D4 formula in cell D6. I'm now going to click on cell D6 and autofill to the end of the range. And you can see that a problem is now revealed. Let's look at the Bugatti price. And C6 has been correctly adjusted to C7 to reference the dollar price of the Bugatti, but D4, that was correctly referencing the exchange rate, has now been adjusted to D5, and that's not correct. In other words, D4 is an absolute cell reference. You learned about absolute references in lesson 312. So I'll click on cell D6. I'll click on the formula bar just to the right of D4 and press the F4 key on the keyboard once to add a dollar symbol in front of both the D and the 4 in the formula. I'll now press the Enter key, and I'll autofill that formula down to the end of the range. If I now look at the Bugatti Veyron price, you can see that both the price and the exchange rate are being correctly referenced, and that's the case for each of the cars in the list. Now you might think that this is exactly the problem that you solved in lesson 312, and of course it is. And if all you were interested in was the GBP prices, then you wouldn't need mixed references. But we want to calculate the price in the Euro, Japanese yen, Canadian dollar and Swiss franc. Let's see what happens when I click on cell D6 and autofill that formula across the range. I'll click on the Japanese yen price now of the Shelby to see what's gone wrong. When I click on cell F6, I can see that I'm still referencing the GBP exchange rate, and instead of referencing the dollar price of the Shelby in cell C6, I'm now referencing cell E6. So let's solve this problem in 2 steps. First of all, I'll adjust the formula so that every time I reference correctly the dollar price in cell C6. I'll click back on the formula in cell D6, which is correct, and I'll consider the cell reference C6 that's pointing to the dollar price of the Shelby. Now as I go down the column, the number part of that reference is being correctly adjusted, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the letter part is correctly staying the same, as the dollar price is always in column C. As I autofill across the columns, I don't want the letter part of that formula to be incremented. Instead of going C, D, E, F, I want it to always be pointing to column C. So if I add a dollar sign just in front of the C part of the formula, everything should work fine. Let's begin by autofilling that formula down column D. Now remember, all these formulas are correct in column D, so apart from that dollar sign, I don't expect any of them to change. Let's autofill down, and you can see that that is the case. None of those formulas have changed. But now I'll autofill across the columns, and you can see that I'm correctly referencing the dollar price now for each column. Let's click on that Japanese yen price again, and you can see that I'm correctly referencing the dollar price of the Shelby. So I've solved the first part of the formula, but I'm still pointing at the GBP US dollar exchange rate in D4. So let's look at that formula, again in cell D6. Now D4 is correct in column D, but in column E, I'd like to be looking at E4. And in column F, I'd like to be looking at F4. So clearly the letter part of D4 needs to be a relative reference, but the 4 part needs to remain as an absolute reference because the exchange rates are always in row 4. So I'll remove the dollar sign in front of the D and press the Enter key. Once again, I need to make sure that the formulas in column D, which I know are correct, are not going to be changed by removing the dollar sign in front of D. So I'll autofill down the column, and apart from that dollar sign, I expect all the formulas to stay exactly the same. And they have done, of course. All right, let's now try autofilling across the column, and as I do, you can see that the exchange rate is being correctly adjusted. Let's look at that Japanese yen price again. This time, I'm correctly referencing the US dollar Japanese yen exchange rate, and I'm correctly referencing the Shelby price in US dollars. So I can now autofill those formulas to the entire range. I'll begin with the formula in cell D6. I'll autofill it right across to the Swiss franc, and then I'll autofill the complete row down to the bottom of the range. Let's audit one of those formulas now at random. Why don't I take the Zonda price in Canadian dollars? And I can see I'm correctly referencing the US dollar price of the Zonda and the US dollar Canadian dollar exchange rate. Now I'll change the worksheet so that I'm showing values rather than formulas. And to do that, it's the Formulas tab on the ribbon. In the Formula Auditing group, Show Formulas. And now I can see a familiar problem where the columns are not quite wide enough to display their contents. So I select all of the column headers and double-click on the intersection between any 2 columns in order to put things right. And I can now correctly see all of the prices for all of the cars in all of the currencies. Before winding up this lesson, let me just show you how to use the F4 key on the keyboard to apply a mixed cell reference. I'll click on the formula in cell D6 and notice in the formula bar that the D4 mixed cell reference is showing as $4. That means relative D and absolute 4. Before automatically creating a mixed reference, I need to position the insertion point so that it's touching the cell reference $4. So I could have the insertion point here, or here, or here, or here, and all of those will work fine. Now I'll press the F4 key on the keyboard once, and you can see that the cell reference has now changed to absolute D relative 4. Press again, and I now have relative D relative 4. Press again, I have absolute D absolute 4. Press again, and I have the correct reference of relative D absolute 4. So I'll now press the Enter key to save that formula into the cell. All that remains now is to save your work, and I'm going to save with the new name International Price List 1, and as usual I'll save to the folder above my sample files folder. I click the Save button, and you've now completed Lesson 313, Understand Mixed Cell References.